Hello there once again, and welcome to The Verdict. I'm Mick Cornett, your host, going solo this week. Kent Myers has the week off. He'll be back with us next week. Our guest today is going to be a familiar name to most of you that live in Oklahoma, especially if you're a sports fan. It is Mike Sherman. He is the sports editor of the Oklahoman. Today's guest on The Verdict. We'll get started right after this break.
I've always been a public servant. I've served either tribes, I've served the federal government, or I've served state governments. The law allows me to express my natural desire to advocate. My name is Stephanie Cochran. I am an attorney and I am Chickasaw. Lawyers give their clients, and in my case, tribal governments, a voice. And it's through legal decisions that tribes have been able to accomplish and to regain some much lost footing that they encountered in the late 1800s and the 1900s. When I reflect back on this time in history, I think I'll look at it in terms of opportunity. And I think now we have to turn those opportunities into long-term success for our future generations.
See more stories about the Chickasaw people at profilesofanation.com.
People have been talking about energy independence for a long time. It's always been popular, but today it's possible.
We have an enormous supply of oil and gas in the United States, much more than we thought just a few years ago.
New technology, massive new discoveries, largely made by Oklahoma companies. It literally changes everything.
And Oklahoma is leading the charge. Go watch this video to see why. Energy independence starts with us.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. Mick Cornett flying solo today. Kent Myers will be back with us next week. My guest today is Mike Sherman. He's the sports editor at the Oklahoman. Mike has a varied background. He's an award-winning journalist originally out of Savage, Maryland. Attended college at Central State University in Edmond, now UCO. Went to work for the Oklahoman immediately, worked for the Times, the afternoon paper, and the morning paper, the Oklahoman. And then had a few years where he left the state, worked back east, but came back in '03 as the sports editor, and he remains the guy in charge of that award-winning sports page. Mike, welcome back to The Verdict.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. Talk about growing up in Savage, Maryland. Were you a big sports fan as a kid? Did you have pennants on the wall? Did you collect baseball cards? What were you doing?
The whole shebang, Mick. I inherited a big baseball collection from some older cousins who got tired of it. Then another cousin, then another cousin. I was sitting on a pretty big collection of cards by the time I got around to buying them. 10 cents. I used to sweep the local supermarket 3 times a day to try to earn money to buy baseball cards. I just was a fanatic about it, collect pop bottles and all that stuff, pennants. And what fueled it was the success of the sports teams we followed. Of course, in those days, I grew up late 60s, 70s. The Orioles went to the World Series every year, 69, 70, 71, 100 wins. We were spoiled, rotten by the Orioles' success. My son sort of got the Orioles' love handed down to him. And last year they made the playoffs for the first time in his life. So really different. And the Baltimore Colts, of course, in those days, my parents had season tickets. They were at the 58 sudden death game in Yankee Stadium, took the train up for the game. They passed that on to me. So I was at Colts, Orioles games every chance we got. I remember sitting at home listening to the game on the radio listening to the pregame on the radio as we were eating supper. My mom would say, you know, if we hurry with the dishes, we can get in there for the first pitch. She was an enabler. And then on Saturdays, I had some neighbors that had season tickets to Maryland football games. I was in there, went to a ton of Maryland basketball games. So that's kind of the air I breathed.
Journalism side, did you get involved in high school?
I did. School paper, all that. And I remember we took a tour to the Baltimore Sun building, and I asked when our class went into the Sun, I asked to meet the guy who covered the Colts, and I got to talk to him for 10 or 15 minutes and realized at that point knew right what I wanted to do. Of course, before that, my mom said that I always told her I got Sports Illustrated for a Christmas present in 1970. And the first issue I got was the Blunder Bowl, Colts, Cowboys, Super Bowl V.
That O'Brien's kick?
Jim O'Brien field goal, 16-13. The only people in America who thought it was a good game was me and my dad. My mom thought it was terrible. She thought the Colts deserved to lose. We were thrilled. So anyway, there it was, my favorite team on the cover of Sports Illustrated. I started reading. I thought, it'd be really cool to be one of those people who could go to these games and write about it and bring it home for folks. And I just always wanted to do it.
And for college, you went to UCO?
Went to UCO. It was a great place to get practical experience right away. And then I was at the Vista for a couple semesters, and I got a phone call. The faculty advisor had talked to Bob Colin, who needed somebody to do box scores for the Oklahoma City Times every morning. So show up at work at 5 o'clock, work till 9 o'clock, get in the car, drive north on Broadway Extension, go to class for a couple hours, then drive back to the Oklahoma City Times. And then I worked part-time at the paper.
Wait, what does do a box score mean?
Do a box score, you have to put coding on it. The Associated Press used to send them in by a computer, and each paper had to make them fit their format.
I see.
So some papers ran them wide, and some papers ran them narrow. Some papers liked to make sure that the Texas Ranger box score got on top. Others, the Baltimore Orioles. Some papers ran these kind of results. So I tailored it all for Oklahoma readers. And that's really where I got to learn what was important in Oklahoma. Bob Colin, our late sports editor at that time, was from Cushing, Oklahoma, went to Oklahoma State, had called, officiated football all around, knew every small town, the nickname of every high school in the state. So I learned at his foot. And that's really where I realized what was important to readers here.
And they let you write.
They let me write some. I remember a bunch of, Central State won the national championship in wrestling, I think '84. Big time team. Eddie Griffin was the coach. And then that spring, some of them, Todd Osborne was one of them, a couple others, they transferred to Oklahoma State. And I broke the story for the Oklahoma City Times. I remember that was my first byline. They stripped the story right across the Oklahoma City Times. It was the first time. I also used to do something called the baseball census. I don't know if you remember this, but in those days there wasn't an internet where you could find out where all the guys from Oklahoma were playing.
I do remember that.
So every summer I would call A-ball, AA, AAA. I'd call Scranton. I'd call all the Eastern League teams. Do you have any Oklahomans? I would work off of the previous year's census, as Bob Colin called it, and I'd find out where all the Oklahomans in professional baseball were playing. Then we'd do a cartoon, Darren Dilks, some of these kind of names, Gary Green from Oklahoma State. We'd find out where all the Okies were playing ball, and we would run a big, huge section of stats every year. And now you can get that stuff on your phone.
It's changed a lot.
It has.
And then at some point you were enticed to leave. What was the thinking going in that you were going to leave the state and leave the paper where you had started?
I'm an East Coast guy. My parents were getting a little bit older. I loved, I can't believe I ever left the ocean. I mean, I love the ocean. I used to spend a week every summer at Ocean City, Maryland. Between that and going to the Oriole games, my friends never believed I'd moved to Oklahoma, and they were surprised when I did. I was a high school writer at the Oklahoman for about 10 years, and my wife got a job as a medical sales rep manager back in Philadelphia. That's pretty close to my parents. So, we were in our early 30s, or I was anyway, and we just thought, hey, let's try it out. I took a job for a small paper in Westchester, Pennsylvania, writing news for a year, actually. And then within about a year of that, there was an opening for a sports editor in Utica, New York. I knew some people. Went up there 3 years. 5 years in Nashville, really neat town. In fact, it reminds me a lot what Nashville was then, with the Titans arriving, with the Predators arriving, is really what Oklahoma City has become. A lot of it, Mick, though, was, I always wanted to be back in a big league city. And so in Philadelphia I was, in Nashville it turns out I was. And in those days, whoever thought Oklahoma City was going to be a big league city?
And you called them, they called you. How did that transpire when you decided to come back as a sports editor?
I had stayed in touch with Barry Trammell and all the people I worked with at the Oklahoman through the years. And I remember playing golf with Barry we came and visit because my wife still had family here. She grew up in Tuttle. And so we would come in to visit, and sometimes I'd go play golf with Barry, Lake Hefner South. In fact, we played the day before OU beat Syracuse. I think they blocked a field goal to win the game. Donovan McNabb, of course, it was really hot, and he had one of his sideline episodes when he wasn't running all over the Sooners that day. It
was a John Blake team.
John Blake team. He was sort of losing it on the sidelines in more ways than one. But anyway, Barry and I played golf that day, and I remember him saying, you know, I see no reason why we can't be one of the best sports sections in the country. And I kind of thought, like, really? Well, really, Barry, when he became a columnist at the Oklahoman, he was sports editor for a long time. I saw the changes that were coming in the city and also how the paper was responding to it. We were really reflecting how important sports are in this community. And I wanted to be a part of it, and I always said, sort of, if there's ever anything open. And then they called me. They had an opening for a sports editor. I remember I interviewed the day that OSU was playing in the Houston Bowl against Southern Miss. All the writers and everybody were down there in Houston, but I came in over the Christmas holidays and interviewed. They offered me the job. It was a tough choice. I had 2 small children. We lived in Nashville. Our family loved Nashville, but it was coming home in a lot of ways, and I really could see that this was a great sports market, but it was getting better.
And the advent of the technology was starting to impact your business. We'll talk about that, how the newspaper business has changed, with Mike Sherman, sports editor of the Oklahoman, when we get back.
When you have something important to communicate, it becomes clear that there's a lot of competition for your audience's attention. So how can your message stand out and actually resonate with your audience? Legal Graphics has the answers. The team at Legal Graphics will work with you to plan, design, and even test your presentation to ensure your message will be heard and remembered. Call Legal Graphics today to schedule an appointment. The readiness is all.
The good life comes naturally to Tulsa, where nature's beauty is matched with an eye for aesthetics. A legacy of neighborhoods graced with lawns and landscaping and handsome homes. A place that seems to have patented an ideal lifestyle. Bank First is loyal to the quality of life Tulsa assures its citizens, to the priority placed on education, culture, and growth. Loyal to builders who transform raw land into residential charm. Developers who see opportunity and add vitality to Tulsa's economy. Bank First serves both enterprise and private lives that need a loyal partner. It's how we help nurture this city's very good life. Bank First. Loyal to Oklahoma. Loyal to you.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. Mick Cornett without Kent Myers this week. Kent will be joining us again next week. Mike Sherman is our guest. He's the sports editor at the Oklahoman. If you saw last segment, we took Mike's kind of life history up to '03 when he returned to Oklahoma. And I'm kind of let's use that as a baseline. How had the technology changed from the time you'd entered the business in the early '80s in those 20 years to 2003?
We had to grab books off the shelf to find out stuff, Mick. We'd have these discussions. A lot of times we talk about how, PTI and all the ESPN shows where they seem to argue for sport. Back in the day when I was in the newsroom, you had a lot of opinionated sports writers and people who loved sports. So we were always running to the shelves and pulling off a book and looking up stats to support our argument, to support our stories. The research. And if you look at the quality of story, today's stories are much more exhaustively researched, and you can do it in the blink of an eye. Mm-hmm. Whereas we used to have to grab books and archives, and you literally would have to go into the archives, go downstairs, pull out these big, thick binders, and look through papers. Now I can look all that up at my desktop, if not on my phone. So really, in that way, I think we're giving people a lot more thorough product right now. But so can everybody. Everybody can do that same level of research. So the competitiveness changed. Even in 2003, you could start to see how that was changing.
Yeah. When did you start to realize that the internet could either be a competitor or a partner if the industry didn't figure that out?
Well, I think when I was in Nashville, you could start to see some people who were writing about the Titans. Nashville, as we said, was a little bit like Oklahoma City. It was an aspiring big league city. It was a minor league town mostly, and I got there right when the Predators had arrived. Won the NHL's approval not over Oklahoma City. I think that was in the first wave, but the Predators came, and all of a sudden you started seeing people writing on the internet about hockey. There was already sort of fans writing about that. And then when the NFL came, ESPN, they were covering the Titans from ESPN, from Bristol. So they didn't have to be in the market to be interested. And so you could see that when pro sports arrived in Nashville, that it wasn't different. It was different, that the folks who were at the local TV stations and at the local newspaper didn't have a monopoly on it anymore. By the time I got here, it had advanced some more. You were starting to see bloggers, you were starting to see people who were interested, lifelong lovers of OU football, for instance, could throw up their own website and they could have their opinions or their own research. So we were getting competition. And then came ESPN, of course. By that time, ESPN.com was really starting to get going, and we had competition from both levels, sort of sideways from the Tulsa World and TV stations, sort of from bloggers and from the big boys at ESPN.
The management at the Oklahoman decided to invest early on the technology side, to get out in front of it and invest in the future of the business. A lot of other papers that didn't make it didn't have that foresight.
They didn't, and we're blessed. When we started doing video at the Oklahoman, I like to say we were driving on paved roads. We weren't off-roading it. They hired two of the best videographers or shooters in the market to shoot for us, and they do OU and OSU games right now. They do Thunder stuff. They hire producers, people to sit behind and run the boards from the local TV stations. They built one studio, and then they realized they didn't think that was sufficient, and they built another one. And that was the case with when we went hard, made a big bet on video. But before that, the internet, NewsOK, which became NewsOK, which was a partnership first with Channel 9, and then once Channel 9 got its own website and we got our own video capability, we parted as friends. We had our own website. But that goes all the way back. The Gaylord family, Mr. Gaylord, had a keen interest in technology. The family always invested in technology. We had one of the first programs in the country to collect high school stats. It's called Sports Track, and we had people taking stats over the phone and plugging them into a computer. We were some of the first paginated pages, newspaper paginated pages were in our office. So, and there's a great picture of Mr. Gaylord, the elder Mr. Gaylord, who founded the paper and helped found the city, sitting behind his desk doing an editorial for Channel 4. So it really runs through that family, and we're the beneficiaries of it.
Mm-hmm. And it has evolved to a point where it's hard to know when writing copy turns into television, you're expected to be able to handle, the sound, the pictures, and the words.
They let people that look like me on television, Nick. The bar has gotten lowered. But there's also training. Those very same producers that we hired, they're the ones who taught me how to sit up straight and talk a little bit better and not say yeah and as much, so that we've received a lot of training. We've also realized that we're no longer on the calendar. We're on the second hand. And so we have blogging all day long. We post to the internet throughout the day. That was a big change. We were on the newspaper calendar, so we, even in the days when I was at the Oklahoma City Times, we had a 9:30 edition, we had an 11 o'clock edition, we had a final edition, the Blue Streak. There's 3 or 4 editions of the afternoon paper, not to mention the evening paper or the morning paper, which had 3 or 4 editions. Now we have an edition whenever news posts whenever we find out about it. So that was a big change. Fortunately, we've made it, and to me it's a lot more fun, frankly.
The technology though also has shifted into how people consume the information. You mentioned earlier, people are on their mobile devices now, watching you or reading one of your stories. I subscribe to the paper digitally. I have an iPad, and I don't get a hard copy anymore. I just have the iPad, and that's how I consume the information that your organization puts out there. How has that changed on the editorial side? Do you have to write differently? Do you have to edit differently when people are consuming information differently?
For a long time, when we were publishing the website, you could see that it was sort of the newspaper lapped over. Mm-hmm. In other words, it was a newspaper story that was just sort of used over here. Mm-hmm. But eventually we came to realize the opportunities of the platform, the opportunities that we had for the web. And so we evolved. That's when we started doing more video. That's when there was more blogging. Well, now the platform is the handheld device or the tablet. And we are gradually discovering the opportunities of that platform. We're learning how to write for it better. We're learning how to create content for it better. It's much more interactive. And so I think what the next frontier for us is to really produce a product and to think about stories that play well on the tablet. You see some of it, we're doing some more of it, but I think what you're going to see is the demand for that lean back experience, as they call it, with the tablet. They don't just want to read a newspaper on a tablet. They want to have that tablet experience. It's different. Mm-hmm. You can blow up and look at maps of Oklahoma City. You can sort data. You can look at coaches' salaries. You can look at all kinds of things that the newspaper wouldn't fit in a newspaper because we don't have that kind of space. Space and time are infinite over here, mm-hmm. and we need to program more and more for it. I think that's the challenge for all the media.
Talk about this, though. There was, when the bloggers kind of became their own little element, the sense of journalism kind of disappeared from that aspect of it. And I don't know if the reader necessarily picked up on that. In other words, if they read it, they assumed it was true because everything they had read historically that had been in print seemed to have a level of journalistic aspect to it. And so there's a very soft gray area now on the internet where you read something, and I'm always suspicious of whether or not it's true or not, kind of depending on the source. But I don't know how many people are that discerning. Does it bother you that although you've had to kind of give up space in the medium to almost anyone who has a keyboard, their standards for journalism are not what you have to adhere to?
Yes, and the responsibility for us is to live up to that standard even more. I mean, I think people always expected us to be fair, balanced, and accurate. But now, if we're going to differ, how do we differentiate ourselves from them? As you said, they have the same technology. They can have their own website. In many cases, they can have a credential. Mm-hmm. Now, they don't travel. They don't tend to go the places we go, although in some cases they are funded. Some of these, some media outlets have picked up bloggers and are underwriting their travels and their expenses. So how are we different? And one way we have to be different is we have to be thinking about our readers. We have to be thinking about what they expect from us. And our stuff, it's almost like the USDA, you got to have that seal of approval. When it's an Oklahoman story, they've got to know that we were fair and balanced. And when we fall short of that, then people can start saying, well, how are you different than a blogger? Mm-hmm. In fact, in some ways, you're inferior to a blogger if we're not careful. Now, some of the voice, though, is interesting. What's opinion and what's genuine reporting, and I think that's another trouble line that we have to be able to differentiate ourselves from the reader. I always say reporters are fact-based. They're reporting fact-based stuff. We got columnists like Barry Trammell and Jenny Carlson, and they can say what their opinion is. A reporter always needs to be standing on a fact.
30 seconds left. Talk about the young people entering the business today. Are they like you in 1983? Do they have those same life experiences? Are they big sports fans? How is this crop of young journalists different?
I think they might even be more sports saturated than we were, Mick. I mean, we got to see 1 or 2 college football games a weekend. Mm-hmm. They see that many by the time they go to bed late Thursday night when they shouldn't be when they should be studying or sleeping. Yeah. So they're already ahead of us. They have all these media outlets. I used to read Basketball Digest. It was what ESPN is, and it came to me every other week. They have advantages that we don't. We're getting a better crop of young sports journalists.
Mike Sherman. And we'll be back right after this.
All children deserve a life of hope and love, but sometimes they experience a life of pain, neglect, and abuse.
When that happens, each child deserves all the quality assistance and representation that can be offered in our legal system. For more information, call 23-CHILD.
Oklahoma Lawyers for Children, helping to bring hope and love back to the lives of abused children.
You will always be mom and dad to me.
You have children come from a different lifestyle, different mindset. You have to open your arms and really do what you have to do to have that child become a part of your family. And if it's more patience, that's what you do. Kids gotta know they can trust you. And that's what we try to do with these kids.
You will always be mom and dad to me.
The Journal-Record is pleased to be a sponsor of The Verdict. The Journal-Record, since 1903, the best source of Oklahoma business news and legal information. And for almost 30 years, Oklahoma political, government, and business leaders have turned to the McCarville Report for accurate, reliable, inside information. Visit the McCarville Report online.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. Mick Cornett, without my partner in crime, Kent Myers. Kent off this week, but he'll be back next week with us. He missed a good show today. Mike Sherman, the Oklahoman sports editor. Mike talked a great deal about growing up as a sports fan in Maryland and coming of age in the 1980s, moving to Oklahoma and going to work for the newspaper. Talked about his early days and then his roughly decade plus back east before he returned in 2003 as the sports editor of the Oklahoman, just about the time the technology changes were really starting to penetrate the business. And I must say the Oklahoman's early investments in those technology sides really paid dividends. You saw a lot of newspapers around the country struggle, fold, combine with other papers, and the Oklahoman wisely got in early and was on the front end of a lot of those technology changes that Mike and his cohorts have seen take place. He runs a pretty good sports department out at the Oklahoman, and you can get more information about them on their website, oklahoman.com. We've got a website, theverdict.tv. Kent and I will be back next week. See you then.